You watched the video that brought you here. If you have not seen it yet, the link is in the description. You heard the 4 paradoxes named, and something shifted. Maybe in how you understand the person you love, maybe in how you understand yourself. But naming a pattern is only the first layer. Today we go underneath it, because each of these paradoxes has a structure, a psychological architecture that was built long before you arrived. And when you understand that architecture, the paradox stops feeling like a wound someone is inflicting. It starts feeling like something much more precise than that, something that was always going to happen, given who they are and how the mind of a deep intuitive is actually built. This is the depth psychology cut. We are going to move through each of the 4 paradoxes again, but this time we are going inside the function stack, inside the Jungian logic, inside the place where these patterns were born. If you are new to cognitive functions, do not worry. You do not need a psychology degree for what comes next. You just need to stay with me. We start with the first paradox, the one we called the desire retreat paradox. In the first video we said this: the deep intuitive wants connection more than almost anything, and then, at a certain moment, they run from it. Not because they stopped loving you, but because loving you started to feel dangerous. Now we go deeper, because the reason it feels dangerous is not the same for all 4 types. The retreat looks identical from the outside, but inside something different is happening depending on who they are. Let us start with the INFJ and the INTJ. Both are led by what we call introverted intuition as their dominant function. And introverted intuition is one of the most unusual cognitive functions in the entire typology. It does not process the world through sensation, or through feeling, or through logic in the conventional sense. It processes through pattern recognition at a level that is almost entirely unconscious. The mind dominated by introverted intuition is constantly building an internal model of reality, of people, of situations, of futures, and that model is the most real thing in their world, more real, often, than what is directly in front of them. Now here is what happens when someone gets close. Real intimacy means being truly seen, and being truly seen means allowing another person to interact with that internal world. Not just the surface, not just the performance, but the actual architecture underneath. And for someone whose dominant function is introverted intuition, that internal world is the self. It is not where they live, it is what they are. Allowing another person inside it feels at an almost cellular level like dissolution, like the boundaries of the self might not hold, like being known could mean being unmade. This is not fear of rejection in the ordinary sense. This is something older and more primal. It is the fear that contact with another consciousness might destabilize the inner vision that organizes everything. And so the retreat is not abandonment, it is self-preservation at the deepest level they know. Now the INFP. The INFP is not led by introverted intuition. They are led by introverted feeling as their dominant function. And introverted feeling is perhaps the most private of all the cognitive functions. It is a deep, continuous, entirely internal process of value evaluation. The INFP is always, beneath every interaction, asking, does this align with who I truly am? Does this honor what I actually feel? And that process is sacred to them in a way that is very difficult to explain to someone who does not share it. The problem with intimacy for the INFP is this. To be truly close to someone, you have to let them see introverted feeling. You have to let them see the raw value core, the thing that is most essentially you, the thing that cannot be defended with argument or explained with logic, the thing that simply is. And if the other person sees it and does not recognize it, if they look at the most real part of you and call it irrational, or too much, or hard to understand, the loss is irreparable in a way that no apology can reach, because what was damaged was not a feeling. It was the proof that the inner world has value. And so the INFP retreats not from you, but from the exposure of introverted feeling. The desire is real. The fear of what happens if the desire is met is equally real. And then the INTP. The INTP is led by introverted thinking as their dominant function. Introverted thinking is a function of internal logical coherence. The INTP mind is always building and refining a sealed framework, a system of understanding that must remain internally consistent to feel trustworthy. And that system is deeply personal. It is not the impersonal logic of a textbook. It is the INTP's own architecture of how reality works. Emotional intimacy introduces something that introverted thinking cannot easily process. Another person, with their own framework, their own emotional reality, their own way of making meaning, cannot simply be integrated into a sealed system. They introduce variables that do not resolve cleanly. And the disorientation this creates is not indifference. It is something closer to vertigo. The INTP retreats not because they do not feel, but because feeling deeply in the presence of another person produces a kind of internal noise that the introverted thinking dominant mind has no reliable map for. The desire is there, but the cognitive architecture was not built for it. Same paradox, 4 different psychological reasons for the same door closing. The second paradox, the one we called the witness-ghost paradox. In the first video we named this quietly. The deep intuitive sees you at a depth that can feel almost uncanny, and yet inside they carry a grief that almost no one touches, the grief of never having been truly seen themselves. Jung had a concept that lives at the center of this paradox. He called it the shadow, not in the popular sense of a dark side, but in a precise psychological sense. The shadow is everything that the conscious ego cannot integrate, the parts of the self that were too threatening, too contradictory, too incompatible with the identity that was built to survive. And one of the most reliable ways to identify what is in someone's shadow is to look at what they cannot receive. The deep intuitive is extraordinary at perceiving others. This is not a metaphor. The dominant and auxiliary functions across all 4 types. Introverted intuition, extroverted feeling, introverted feeling, extroverted intuition, introverted thinking. They are all, in some fundamental sense, oriented toward reading beneath the surface, toward sensing patterns, toward understanding what is not being said. This capacity is real and it is rare. But here is the Jungian irony. The function that is most developed, the function that does the seeing, also creates the deepest blind spot in the opposite direction. Because the deep intuitive has spent so long developing the capacity to perceive, they have very little practice being perceived. Being seen is not a skill they have had to develop. It is something that almost never happened. And what almost never happens becomes, over time, something the psyche does not know how to receive. So when someone tries to truly see a deep intuitive, when someone looks past the surface and reaches toward the real depth, something unexpected happens. The deep intuitive does not open. They deflect. They redirect the attention back outward. They become suddenly interested in you again, in your patterns, in your needs. Because being the one who sees is familiar. Being the one who is seen is dangerous in a way they cannot fully articulate, because they have so rarely had to face it. This is the shadow of the seer. The capacity that defines them is also the defense that keeps them invisible. And the grief they carry, the grief of never being truly found, is partly a grief they have unconsciously participated in creating. Not through malice, through a kind of learned self-erasure so old they no longer recognize it as a choice. If you love a deep intuitive, the most important thing you can offer is not more understanding of them. It is the patience to stay in the room when they deflect, to keep looking quietly without forcing, because the part of them that wants to be found is real. It is just not used to being found, and it does not yet know how to stand still long enough to let it happen. The third paradox, the one we called the overflow resentment paradox. In the first video we said this. The deep intuitive gives far beyond what was asked, far beyond what is healthy. And over time, something accumulates. Not anger at you, something quieter. They resent themselves, and because that resentment has nowhere clean to go, it sometimes lands on you. Now we go inside the function stack, because this paradox works differently for each type, and the differences matter. Start with the INFJ. The INFJ leads with introverted intuition and follows with extroverted feeling as their primary relational function. Extroverted feeling is oriented toward the emotional field of the relationship. It reads the room. It responds to what others need. And for the INFJ, giving through extroverted feeling feels like love expressed in its most natural form. But here is what is underneath it. The dominant function is introverted intuition, and introverted intuition always has a vision. Always. The INFJ does not just love you as you are. They love you in the direction of who they can see you becoming. And the extroverted feeling giving, the care, the attunement, the endless emotional labor, is partly in service of that introverted intuition vision. They are giving toward a future they believe in, which means the real object of love is not always you. It is sometimes the version of you that introverted intuition has already seen. When reality does not move toward the vision, the giving starts to feel like investment in something that is not returning. The resentment is quiet, and it has a moral dimension. I saw what this could be. I gave everything toward it, and it did not become what it should have. Now the INTJ. The INTJ leads with introverted intuition and follows with extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking is a function of external structure and strategy. The INTJ gives through investment, solving problems, building systems, showing up in ways that are deliberate and often invisible. They do not give through warmth in the conventional sense. They give through competence, through doing the things that matter. But like the INFJ, the giving is in service of an introverted intuition vision. And the INTJ also carries introverted feeling as their tertiary function. Introverted feeling in the INTJ is quieter than in the INFP, less developed, often suppressed, but it is there. And it carries a moral core the INTJ rarely names out loud. When they give, there is a deep private sense that they are doing what is right, what love requires. And when that giving is not met, when the relationship does not become what introverted intuition envisioned and introverted feeling believed in, the resentment has two layers. The logical layer, I invested in something that did not return, and the moral layer, deeper and less accessible, I did what was right, and it was not enough. Now the INFP. The INFP leads with introverted feeling, and introverted feeling giving is different from extroverted feeling giving in a way that is crucial to understand. Extroverted feeling gives in response to what others need. Introverted feeling gives in expression of what the self values. When an INFP loves you, they are not primarily responding to your needs. They are expressing their own depth of feeling. The giving is an act of self-expression as much as it is an act of care. This creates a particular problem, because introverted feeling has no natural stopping point. There is no internal accounting function that says, you have given enough. The balance is even. Extroverted thinking is precisely the function that would provide that accounting. And for the INFP, extroverted thinking is the inferior function, largely unavailable. The INFP gives until the value is fully expressed, which is never, and the resentment arrives not at you, but at themselves, for having emptied completely into something that the other person may not have even asked for, and may not have known how to receive. And then the INTP. The INTP leads with introverted thinking and carries extroverted feeling as their inferior function. Extroverted feeling as an inferior function is one of the most important and most misunderstood dynamics in the entire typology. It means that emotional connection and relational giving are not natural for the INTP. They require genuine effort. They are cognitively and emotionally expensive in a way that types with dominant extroverted feeling simply do not experience. When an INTP gives emotionally, when they open, when they reach, when they offer the rare thing of genuine vulnerability, it costs them enormously. And inferior extroverted feeling means they often cannot fully read whether the giving landed, whether the cost was worth it. When it goes unrecognized or unreturned, the resentment is partly at themselves for having tried, for having stepped outside the introverted thinking framework into territory they have no reliable map for, and partly something even quieter, the private conclusion that the experiment confirmed what introverted thinking suspected all along, that this was not safe, that opening was a mistake. The overflow is not generosity gone wrong. It is a very old protection, and the resentment is the signal that the protection has stopped working. The common thread beneath all four is this. In each case, the giving is partly a defense against something, a defense against having to receive, against having to be in the position of needing. Because if I give first, if I give more, if I give beyond what was asked, I control the terms of the exchange. I am never the one who needed more than they were given. Jung called this kind of psychological maneuver a compensation. The conscious mind develops a strategy to avoid confronting what the unconscious cannot yet hold, and what the deep intuitive unconsciously cannot hold is simple and devastating. The fear of needing someone and not being met, the fear that if they stopped giving for a moment and simply waited, simply needed, nothing would come. And the fourth paradox, the one we called the dream grief paradox, the most silent of all. In the first video we named this as the paradox that does not create conflict. It creates distance. The relationship does not end with a confrontation. It ends with a silence that grows, with a warmth that is still present but somehow farther away, and you are left wondering when things changed. Jung gave us the exact concept for what is happening here. He called it projection, and more specifically, in the context of romantic love, he called it the anima and the animus. The anima is the inner feminine figure in the male psyche. The animus is the inner masculine figure in the female psyche. But what matters here is not the gender dynamic, it is the psychological mechanism. Because what Jung observed is this: when we fall in love, we are never falling in love only with the person in front of us. We are falling in love with an inner figure, an archetypal image of the ideal other that lives in the unconscious, and we are projecting that image onto a real human being. This is not pathology. It is how the psyche initiates deep connection. The projection creates the electricity. The feeling of finally having found the person who completes something you did not know was incomplete. The sense of being met at a level you had never reached with anyone else. But the projection is not the person, and at some point, always, reality arrives. For the INFJ and the INTJ, both led by introverted intuition, the projection is built with extraordinary specificity and depth. When introverted intuition projects onto a person, when it decides that this person is the one toward whom the vision points, the image that is overlaid onto reality is not a vague romantic fantasy. It is a fully realized inner construction, detailed, coherent, deeply felt, and deeply, fundamentally, not the person. For the INFP, the projection is built through introverted feeling. The inner figure is not a vision, but a value ideal, a person who embodies what introverted feeling holds most sacred: authenticity, depth, the capacity to be fully present with the inner world of another. When the INFP falls in love, they are in love with the proof that such a person exists. And when reality reveals the ordinary human limitations of the person in front of them, what is lost is not just the relationship, it is the proof itself. For the INTP, the projection is built through extroverted intuition as the auxiliary function. Extroverted intuition generates possibilities. It sees potential everywhere. And when the INTP falls in love, extroverted intuition has already generated an elaborate map of who this person could become, what this relationship could hold, what might be possible if everything developed in the direction it seemed to be pointing. The grief, when it arrives, is not primarily emotional. It is the collapse of a hypothesis the INTP had almost allowed themselves to believe in. In all four cases, what Jung would say is this: the grief that the deep intuitive carries is not primarily about the other person. It is about the inner figure. The projection must eventually be withdrawn, must be recognized as a projection, and when it is, the unconscious demands that the deep intuitive take back what they projected, that they find in themselves what they were looking for in the other person. This is one of the central tasks of what Jung called individuation, the lifelong process of becoming fully oneself. The deep intuitive who has loved and grieved is not simply someone who had a relationship fail. They are someone who was offered an invitation by the unconscious, an invitation to stop looking for the ideal outside and to begin the much harder work of meeting it within. The dream does not end in failure. It ends in a confrontation with the self. 4 paradoxes, 4 layers of depth psychology underneath each one. The desire that retreats, because the inner world cannot survive being entered without losing its shape. The witness that goes unseen, because the capacity that sees others is also the defense that keeps the self invisible. The overflow that turns to resentment, because giving was always partly a protection against needing. And the dream that grieves in silence, because the person they loved was always partly an inner figure. And the grief is the invitation to find that figure within themselves. These are not flaws in how the deep intuitive loves. They are the signature of a psyche that has not yet completed its own individuation. A psyche that is still at its depth, trying to resolve the oldest questions. Am I safe enough to be truly known? Am I worth what I cannot stop giving? Does the person I love exist? Or did I imagine them into being? Jung believed that the unconscious does not make mistakes, that every pattern, including the patterns that cause the most pain, is pointing towards something, a development that has not yet happened, a part of the self that is waiting to be integrated. If you are the deep intuitive, the paradoxes are not your prison. They are your map. The desire and retreat tells you where your fear of dissolution lives. The witness and ghost tells you what your shadow is protecting. The overflow and resentment tells you what you still cannot let yourself receive. And the dream and grief tells you what the unconscious needs you to find in yourself rather than in another person. The work is not to stop loving the way you love. The work is to become conscious of the structure underneath it. Because what you can see, you can hold. And what you can hold, you can begin to move through instead of being moved by. That is what depth psychology offers. Not a cure, a map. And a map, for a deep intuitive, is everything.